Welcome to Sleepwalk Files. Tonight, we are taking a calm, close look at the Dyatlov Pass alien abduction theory. Subscribe for daily stories about strange mysteries made to fall asleep to. Why would nine experienced survivalists, people who knew exactly how to handle the brutal cold of the Ural Mountains, decide to cut their way out of their own tent from the inside? Think about that for a second. They didn't use the zipper. They used a knife to slash through the canvas, fleeing into a blinding February blizzard, some of them barefoot or in nothing but socks. If you're in a tent during a storm, the fabric is your only shield against a certain death. You don't leave it unless whatever is outside is infinitely more terrifying than freezing to death in minutes. For decades, people have asked if the threat was human, but there were no footprints other than their own. No signs of a struggle, no weapon marks, no evidence of an ambush. If it wasn't a person or a predator, what could possibly trigger that kind of primal, blind panic? This is where the theory of an extraterrestrial encounter begins to take hold. It isn't just a wild guess from a forum, it's anchored by something far more unsettling. While Igor Dyatlov and his group were meeting their end on the slopes of Kholat-Syakhl, they weren't the only ones watching the sky. In the days and weeks following the discovery of the bodies, reports began to surface from other hiking groups and locals in the region. They described seeing strange, glowing orange spheres drifting through the atmosphere on the very same night the group died. These weren't shooting stars or weather balloons. Witnesses described them as luminous, pulsing orbs that moved with an intelligence, hovering over the mountains before vanishing. Imagine being in that tent. It's pitch black, the wind is howling, and suddenly the sky lights up with a silent, oppressive orange glow. You look out and see something that defies every law of physics you know. Does that explain the panic? Does it explain why they didn't stop to put on their boots? If you follow the logic of the abduction theory, the hikers didn't just run away from something. They were reacting to a presence. Some believe the orange spheres were scout craft or probes, and that the group stumbled directly into a landing zone. The sheer terror of seeing something non-human, something that shouldn't exist, could have overridden their survival instincts. They weren't running towards safety, they were running away from an impossible sight. This theory suggests that the hikers were targeted, perhaps by a beam of light or a sonic frequency that induced a state of sheer hysteria. It turns the scene from a tragic accident into a crime scene where the perpetrator didn't leave any footprints because it never touched the ground. When you look at the maps of the region and the timing of these sightings, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. The orange spheres weren't isolated incidents, they were a cluster. They centered around the very coordinates where 9 young people were about to be slaughtered by a force that left the tents slashed and the hikers scattered across the snow. But the spheres are just the beginning. The real horror starts when you look at what happened to their bodies once they stopped running. Because as terrifying as those lights were, they don't explain the physical state of the victims. To understand why the hikers fled, we have to look at the injuries they carried with them into the dark. Imagine you're a forensic pathologist in the Soviet Union in 1959. You've been handed the bodies of several young people who froze to death in the mountains. On the surface, it's a tragedy, but a common one. But then you start the internal exam, and you find something that makes no sense. You find a chest cavity that has been crushed. Ribs snapped like dry twigs. A skull fractured with massive force. The kind of trauma you'd expect to see in a high-speed car accident or someone falling from a great height. But here is the part that keeps researchers awake at night. When you look at the skin, there is nothing. No bruising, no lacerations, no abrasions, not a single mark to suggest that a physical object ever hit them. How does a human body sustain massive internal crushing injuries without a single bruise on the skin? In a normal struggle, if someone hits you with a club or a rock, the soft tissue reacts. The capillaries burst, the skin turns purple, there's a point of impact. But for several of the Dyatlov group, the damage was internal and absolute. It was as if the force hadn't come from the outside, pushing in, but from a pressure that permeated the entire body at once. This is where the theory of directed energy or intense atmospheric pressure comes in. If you look at the claims shared in paranormal circles and UFO forums, they point to a specific kind of weapon or technology. They suggest that the hikers weren't hit by a person or an animal, but were targeted by a focused beam of energy. Some theorists argue that a high-frequency sonic weapon or a microwave-style burst could cause internal organs to collapse and bones to shatter while leaving the skin perfectly intact. Think about the physics of that for a second. A physical blow is a localized event, but a wave of pressure, that's a systemic event. It explains why the injuries were so severe yet so clean. It suggests a force that doesn't play by the rules of a fistfight or a landslide. The autopsy reports are public, and they confirm this jarring contrast. You have the sheer violence of the internal fractures sitting right next to the eerie stillness of the external skin. If a boulder had fallen on them, there would be a crushed site. If they had been beaten, there would be hematomas. But there was nothing. Just the wreckage of the skeleton inside a pristine shell. Some skeptics will tell you that the bodies were simply damaged by the weight of the snow or by the way they were recovered from the frozen ground. They argue that after weeks of freezing and thawing, the tissues changed and the pressure of the snowpack did the work. But does that explain why only some of the hikers had these specific, high-energy injuries while others didn't? Does it explain the precision of the fractures? When you pair this impossible trauma with the reports of those glowing orange spheres in the sky, the story shifts. It stops being a story about a hiking accident and starts looking like a story about a test. Whether it was a secret Soviet experiment or something that came from further away, the evidence suggests the hikers encountered a force that could crush a human ribcage without even touching the skin. It's a level of violence that feels clinical, almost surgical, and it leads us to a much darker question. If something could do that to their bones, what did it do to the rest of them? If the internal injuries were a result of some unseen pressure, why did the trauma stop at the bone? Because when the investigators reached the bodies of the last few hikers, they found something that didn't fit the profile of a crushing force. They found missing pieces. Take the case of Lyudmila Dubinina. When her body was recovered from a ravine, the examiners discovered that her tongue had been removed, not torn out in a struggle and not decayed by the elements. It was simply gone. Along with it, her eyes were missing. On the surface, this looks like the work of scavengers. Wolves or birds of prey usually go for the soft tissues first, but that's where the logic begins to unravel. The bodies were found in a frozen wasteland, often partially buried in snow or tucked into crevices where animals would have struggled to reach them without leaving a trace. More importantly, there were no jagged tear marks, no scattered remnants of tissue, and no evidence of the chaotic feeding patterns you see in a typical animal attack. The missing tissue felt surgical. It felt intentional. In the darker corners of the mystery, this is where the theory of biological sampling comes in. If an unknown entity or a clandestine government project had encountered these students, would they be interested in the whole person? Or would they be interested in the sensory organs? The eyes and the tongue are the primary tools for communication and perception. To a collector of biological data, these would be the most valuable specimens. It turns the scene from a tragedy into a laboratory. But the most unsettling detail isn't what was missing from the bodies. It's what was found on their clothes. When the hikers' garments were analyzed, reports surfaced of radioactive contamination. Now, there's no reason for a group of students on a winter trek in the Ural Mountains to be carrying radioactive material. They weren't scientists. They weren't working in a lab. Yet, the levels of radiation found on some of the clothing were significantly higher than the background levels of the region. This is the detail that keeps the alien and military theories alive. Radiation is a signature. It's the fingerprint of high-energy propulsion, of nuclear reactors, or of weapons that don't leave a visible trail. If you combine the radioactive clothing with the missing organs and the internal crushing injuries, a pattern emerges. You're no longer looking at a series of unfortunate accidents. You're looking at the aftermath of an encounter with a technology that the Soviet Union wouldn't have admitted existed in 1959. Some argue that the radiation could have come from the hikers' own gear, or perhaps they had unknowingly walked through a contaminated zone. But the Ural Mountains are vast, and the specific location of the camp was remote. The odds of 9 people all stepping into a radioactive pocket just as they were being terrorized out of their tents are slim. It suggests the source of the radiation was the same source that caused the panic. Something that emitted a glow, something that could exert massive pressure from a distance, and something that viewed the human body as a set of parts to be harvested. It leaves you wondering if the hikers were even the primary target, or if they were just an inconvenient witness to something that wasn't supposed to be seen. Imagine you are a seasoned survivalist. You know how to read the wind, how to pitch a tent in a gale, and exactly how quickly hypothermia can kill you in the Russian winter. Now, imagine something happens inside that tent, something so sudden and so terrifying that your only instinct is to get out, not through the door, not by unzipping the flap, but by taking a knife and slicing through the heavy canvas from the inside, just to save a few seconds of time. That is the scene the search parties found on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. The tent was collapsed and covered in snow, but the cuts were clear. The hikers hadn't been attacked from the outside. There were no footprints of an intruder leading into the camp. The threat was either already inside with them, or it was something so overwhelming that the tent felt like a trap. When you look at the trail the group left behind, the panic becomes even more visceral. They didn't run in a chaotic scatter. The footprints show they moved in a disciplined, almost rhythmic line, heading down the slope toward the woods. But here is the detail that defies every law of survival. They were practically naked. Some were in socks. Some were barefoot. Some were wearing only their underwear. In temperatures that can drop to -30 degrees, your brain tells you that the cold is the enemy. But for these 9 people, the cold was a secondary concern. Whatever they were fleeing was worse than freezing to death. If it were a bear or a group of hostile locals, they would have fought or screamed. Instead, they marched away from their only source of shelter and warmth, moving in a trance-like state of desperation. This is where the theory of a non-human encounter takes hold. If you believe the reports of those glowing orange spheres seen by other groups in the region, the timeline starts to make a haunting kind of sense. Imagine a light descending from the sky, bathing the tent in an unnatural glow, accompanied by a frequency or a pressure that triggers a primal, biological flight response. It wouldn't be a conscious decision to leave. It would be a neurological command to run. Some researchers on forums like Reddit and in UFO documentaries suggest the group wasn't just running from a light, but from a weaponized frequency, something that creates an overwhelming sense of dread or disorientation. It explains why they didn't stop to put on their boots. It explains why they walked in a line, perhaps guided by a force they couldn't see, but could feel pressing against their chests. They weren't just hiking into a blizzard, they were fleeing a perimeter. They left behind their food, their gear, and their safety, venturing into the dark of the Ural forest with nothing but the clothes on their backs. As they moved further from the tent, the panic didn't fade, it just changed shape. They weren't just trying to get away from the camp anymore. They were trying to get away from something that had followed them out into the snow. If the deaths of the 9 hikers were simply a tragic accident, why did the Soviet government treat the investigation like a state secret? Usually, when a group of students dies in the wilderness, the case is closed once the bodies are identified and the cause of death is listed. But with the Dyatlov group, the reaction of the authorities was immediate, clinical, and strangely defensive. The files were sealed. Access to the mountain was restricted, and the official verdict was perhaps the most frustrating sentence in the history of forensic science. The investigators concluded that the hikers died due to an unknown, compelling natural force. Think about that phrasing. They didn't say an avalanche, or a storm, or a predator. They used the words compelling natural force. It's a phrase that sounds like it was written by someone who knew exactly what happened, but was legally forbidden from saying it. It's a placeholder. It's the kind of language used when the truth is more dangerous than the mystery. This is where the theory shifts from the paranormal to the political. For decades, researchers and theorists have pointed to the timing and the location as evidence of something far more terrestrial, but just as sinister. The Ural Mountains weren't just a hiking destination in 1959. They were a playground for the Cold War. The region was dotted with secret military installations and testing grounds for the Soviet weapons program. There are persistent claims that the hikers didn't stumble upon aliens, but upon a clandestine military test. Imagine a secret missile launch or a vacuum bomb trial gone wrong. Some suggest the orange spheres reported by other witnesses weren't spacecraft, but plasma discharges from a weaponized atmospheric experiment. If the group had been caught in the blast radius of a directed energy weapon or a chemical agent, it would explain the sudden, irrational panic. It would explain the internal crushing injuries that left the skin intact, as if the hikers were hit by a shockwave of pressure rather than a physical object. But the government's behavior suggests they weren't just covering up a mistake, they were erasing a footprint. When the bodies were recovered, there were reports of radioactive contamination on some of the clothing. Why would a group of hikers in the middle of the wilderness be carrying isotopes? If they had encountered a crashed satellite or a fallen piece of military hardware, the Soviet state would have moved heaven and earth to recover the object and silence anyone who saw it. The theory is that the hikers were collateral damage in a game of global espionage. The state didn't just close the case, they attempted to rewrite the narrative. They provided contradictory explanations for years, shifting from theories of indigenous attacks to weather anomalies, all while keeping the primary evidence locked in a vault. Why go to such lengths for 9 students? If it was just a freak accident, the truth wouldn't be a threat to the Kremlin. But if the hikers had witnessed something they weren't supposed to see, a recovered object from the stars or a weapon that could bend the laws of physics, then the silence becomes a necessity. The government wasn't protecting the families from the grief. They were protecting a secret that was more valuable than the lives of the 9 people who died on that slope. The silence of the state didn't solve the mystery. It turned the Dyatlov Pass into a monument of suspicion, leaving us to wonder if the most terrifying thing in those mountains wasn't the force that killed the hikers, but the people who spent the next 60 years pretending it never happened. Why is it that a tragedy from 1959, buried in the frozen wastes of the Ural Mountains, feels more alive today than it did during the Cold War? If you spend any time in the darker corners of Reddit or on UFO documentary channels, you'll find that the Dyatlov Pass isn't just a historical event anymore. It's a digital ghost. It has evolved into a modern obsession, a puzzle that thousands of internet sleuths try to solve every single day. They pore over the original black and white photos, analyzing the angle of the sliced tent or the exact position of the bodies in the snow, searching for the one detail the Soviet investigators missed. The internet loves the alien theory because it's the only one that ties every impossible detail together. To a forum user on Our Death of Nine or a UFO researcher, a slab avalanche doesn't explain the glowing orange spheres seen by other witnesses. It doesn't explain why Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue or why some of the clothing showed traces of radiation. In the digital occult, the theory is simple. The hikers stumbled upon something not of this world, and the resulting panic was a biological reaction to a technology we still don't understand. Of course, there are those who try to pull us back to Earth. Skeptics often point to a theory called the slab avalanche. They argue that a heavy ledge of snow slid down the slope, crushing the hikers in their sleep and forcing them to cut their way out of the tent in a blind, suffocating panic. Others suggest infrasound, low-frequency sound waves caused by the wind whipping across the mountains, which can trigger intense feelings of dread and nausea, potentially driving the group into a psychotic fugue state. It's a clean, scientific explanation. It removes the monsters and the spaceships. But for many, the scientific answer feels too small. It doesn't satisfy the hunger for a deeper, darker truth. When you look at the evidence through the lens of a conspiracy, the slab avalanche feels like another compelling natural force, verdict handed down by a government that didn't want to admit the truth. The lack of a definitive, universally accepted answer is exactly what keeps the alien theory alive. In the absence of a smoking gun, the vacuum is filled by the most unsettling possibility. That's why the story persists. It's not just about 9 students who died in the snow. It's about the terrifying idea that there are forces in the wilderness and in the sky that can erase a human being without leaving a bruise. It's the fear that we can be hunted by something we cannot see and then covered up by a system that doesn't care if we exist. As we scroll through the threads and watch the documentaries, we aren't just looking for facts. We're looking for a sign that the world is stranger than we're told. The Dyatlov Pass has become a mirror for our own suspicions about authority and the unknown. Until a body is exhumed with a piece of otherworldly metal in its chest, or a secret Soviet file is leaked that names the object on the mountain, the mystery will never truly die. It will just keep echoing through the digital void, a frozen scream that refuses to go silent. But if you dig deeper into the archives, past the official verdicts, you find the fragments of a story the Soviet state tried to scrub clean. There are the reports from the search parties, the men who actually walked that slope in February of 1959. Some of them noted a strange quality to the snow around the tent, a peculiar compaction that didn't match the wind patterns of the Urals. Then there are the diaries. In the final entries of the group, there is a sense of confidence, a lack of fear, right up until the moment the world broke. If this was a military operation, why the secrecy 60 years later? Some researchers point to the coordinates of the pass, suggesting the hikers weren't just on a trek, but had wandered into a restricted testing corridor. There are long-standing rumors of parachute mines, the R-7 missile tests, or something far more experimental being launched from the nearby plains. The theory suggests that a failed weapon, perhaps a directed energy prototype, hit the slope, creating a localized pressure wave. This would explain the internal crushing of the ribs and the fractured skulls without the external bruising of a physical blow. It would also explain the orange glow reported by other hikers in the distance, not as alien ships, but as the ionized trail of a weapon that didn't just kill the group, but erased the very air around them. Then we have the missing tissue. Lyudmila Dubinina's missing tongue and eyes have always been attributed to scavengers by the official record. But forensic enthusiasts on forums like Reddit often argue that the pattern is too precise, too surgical. They point to the radioactive traces found on the clothing of some of the victims as a clue. Radiation doesn't just appear in the middle of a mountain range. It suggests a core, a fuel source, or a biological agent that the Soviet cleanup crews were desperate to contain. Think about the way the bodies were found, scattered in a desperate line toward the cedar tree. They weren't just running from the cold, they were running from something that had rendered their shelter a death trap. Was it a sound, a light, or a realization that the sky had opened up to claim them? When we look at the grainy photos of the tent, sliced open from the inside, we aren't looking at a survival mistake. We're looking at the physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated terror. The kind of terror that makes a human being choose a frozen death in the wind over staying one more second inside a piece of canvas. That is the evidence they couldn't bury, the sheer, visceral panic left behind in the snow. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to Sleepwalk Files to stay up to date with new mysteries and long videos to fall asleep to every night.